I think it's now a kind of moment to move on to the next part of the morning, which will be discussion. And I'd like to welcome up onto the stage now Yemen Blake, who's a poet, artist, producer and researcher. Please excuse the line break chaos that's just come onto this slide. The next person I want to ask is Pam Bernard, who's reading music at Cambridge University. Nathaniel Facey, who's an alto saxophonist. And Claire Fox, the director of the Institute of Ideas. I asked for a group panel for this discussion, and I did something which in some respects is heresy, because I didn't ask anybody who's involved in a Sistemas project at the moment. I think there's a real need for us to expand the conversation outside of just the people who do Sistemas work towards others in saying, where should we go next? Can this work? If so, how will it work? So I've asked three venerable learned practitioners, all sorts of people, and I said to them, look, why don't you take a few minutes to just give a few thoughts towards this. So for this second part of the session, they will be talking a little bit about some of the issues I've raised and areas they think are of interest. And we'll probably, I hope, talk also from the point of view of saying, you know, what's their work which has brought them to find a thing like this interesting. And then for the last part of the morning, I would like to throw, for the last half an hour, 40 minutes, this open for you so that we have a proper discussion together, actually, about some of the issues which are raised by that. So, Pam, can I start by asking you to talk a little bit about?
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to speak for a little less, I hope, than 10 minutes around three themes. The first is looking at the critique of the value and the assumptions underpinning this program, this amazing program that has all of the qualities that Marshall has beautifully presented this morning, but to critique it around the view of really what's underpinning it. Can you translate one approach into another country? Can you reproduce one system in another setting? What are the ways that we can actually use literature and theory to help us kind of move forward with this? And I'll be quoting Foucault there. I'll be speaking, my second theme will be around the models of children's cultures. And the models of children's cultures in Europe, very different to Latin America. How can we translate those models? What do we learn? Can we take from literature again? And my third point is around the imperatives in terms of an approach like this. The critical characterization that Marshall's beautifully presented to us today, that need to have those essences continued, but how to create inclusivity, immersion and musical excellence in a completely different set of communities within one city, let alone a country or a multiplicity of countries. So let me take Foucault, who's written about power and culture, and he said this, that the critique of a system is not a matter of saying that things are not right as they are. And we have a number of people that have critiqued El Sistema in the Venezuela context. Foucault says it is a matter of pointing out on what kinds of assumptions, what kinds of familiar, unchallenged and unconsidered modes of thought, the practices that we accept, rest. So we were watching some amazing presentations. I didn't hear a child's voice speak about El Sistema. I didn't hear the student voice say what they thought it was. I didn't hear the voice of children and their representations of their experience. Art as a battleground was said, as a metaphor. How interesting. When we think about the revolutionary social project of El Sistema, what's revolutionary about it? What could be revolutionary about it? Is that relevant here? Whose music is being presented? Whose lives are being changed? Who is actually conducting the conduct of such a practice? And I'm seeing a sort of form of domination, but which may lead to a state of domination. And this is something we need to be thinking about again, the assumption underpinning the practice. Is it something that should be translated or reconstructed, revisioned? What are the ethics about such a regime? Is there a single solution to 70 to 90% of the students coming from poor socio-economic backgrounds? Do we actually rarefy the poor by engaging in these kinds of activities? Do we actually create a space of otherness reserved for children already othered because of living in socio-economic certain contexts? And are we actually objectifying that sort of otherness? I've got another book, I'm a reader, so I've got to bring books with me just to prove what I do during the day. And in this book, there's two really confused, two contradictory views of culture. Levinas says that we should think of culture in this way. The concept reflects a profound respect for the absolute difference of the other. The absolute difference of the other. I'm thinking now classical music of the other. I'm thinking of children's musical practices and cultures and the multiple cultures that children live within using internet and so forth. So we look at the absolute difference of the other with a capital O, who should not be subsumed into ourselves as our experience, but keep that difference and celebrate that difference. Or do we take another view of culture? Rima, who's a very esteemed American arts education philosopher and theorist, who says we should approach a culture as something different by means of understanding the similarities, of actually sort of integrating the practice, as well as noticing the differences, but integrating, merging. So where do we position ourselves when it comes to a sort of classical kind of view of music? Okay, 5 minutes. Time moves in mysterious ways when you're up here. So if that was my first point, in terms of let's look at what's underpinning these words: culture, childhood, learning, musics. There isn't one. Musics. Whose? And who's delivering this? Even having a conductor says something about domination. Let's look at models of childhood cultures. The traditional model of childhood sees the child as dependent upon adults. And I saw that to some extent in those images. B, sees the child as developing through various stages of immaturity on the way to becoming an adult. We might be thinking becoming an adult musician. C, sees the child as an object of adult study or adult work or adult methods. More newer ways of thinking about children and childhood cultures by Jackie Marsh, who's an English education researcher, sees the child as agent, as having a lot of power, as having a lot of freedom, as having a lot of creativity, a lot of ideas, having a voice. Sees the child as being, not becoming. Sees the child as having rights, not being controlled, not being structured and organised, and not being led into 24 hours of practice across the week. The child is active participant, but actually impacting on that social world. So having that voice, and I've now got a book here who says, whose music education is it? The role of student voice. In this country, as in a global sort of sense, there is a real revolution going on in music education in terms of understanding the child's voice. What musics are they engaging in? What approaches and ways of living and being are they engaging with? So really looking at children's voices and children's approaches and hearing their empowerment, their choice of musics. I'm thinking now of Lucy Green, who has developed musical futures, informal learning, where the child, the student makes the decision as to the repertoire. So how would the learners curate the repertoire to be learned? Interesting problematisation. Okay, third point, third theme. Exploring the imperatives for Europe, for a European approach to this. Could there be a Europe Sistema? Or would there be Sistemas, situated, place-based approaches where you do have inclusivity, immersion and musical excellence, but there is sustainability in those communities that look different depending on where they are, so that we see something that is really resonating and celebrating the rights of children, their active participants, impacting upon the project, where the roles of the teachers are defined perhaps differently to what we were seeing before, where the model of musical knowledge assumed looks different. Whose musical knowledge? Where we see the child not as an object of adult work or study or management or leadership, but rather more leadership arising from the learners themselves. There's a lot of literature on creativity, and it's one of my specialist areas in research. And in early childhood, researchers are saying we should not privilege particular cultural forms that are held in high value by adults. That creative practice in early childhood settings and schools needs to engage with a range of cultural practices, children's cultural practices and interests. And so we need to be thinking about introducing children to high culture. Is that the value system that we're working with here? Is that what is appropriate in this community, in this society? So, key point number 3, sustainability. Having groups of schools, perhaps, communities webbed within. But those communities need to know that the money isn't going to be pulled out with the next election, and that the political will is there to sustain the program. So you're going to need to have the venues, the teaching, the local authority, the staff support, the educational psychologists, the social workers, all helping together. How to sustain that on a long-term commitment, where there's a sense of ownership, where the community feel and are owning it, where there's experimentation, not just tradition, and where it reflects the perspectives of the young and the old and of different ethnic groups. Sustainability, not stigmatising the poor, but rather celebrating humanity and communities together. This, I think, is the challenge for El Sistema in Europe.
Thanks very much indeed. There are a few interesting items there which I'm sure we'll want to go into in a while. Yemen, what's your reaction hearing that?
My reaction is, firstly, about the question of whether we're adopting something, whether it's trying to change it to our system. I kind of think it has to be different. in this country. It has to be different in the UK because the culture is different. The educational system is different in terms of our children and young people having much more school time in a day. I've just come back from Salvador in Brazil, and the young people there go to school either in the morning or in the afternoon, so the time that they have is much more open. And that's time around they can choose what to do, or sometimes the situations where they're encouraged to go to different programs. And in terms of the kind of comments and the thoughts that I prepared for my kind of 5-10 minutes, it's the focusing on young people and time and activity that I'd like to go into. Just as a kind of way to introduce myself, I'm an artist mainly working with literature, photography and performance. And at South Bank Centre I've been working with the Learning and Participation Department here since 2008 on young people's projects and programmes. And that over that time, the collaboration between myself and the department is trying to look at how we can change the way of working with young people that isn't based around the projects, the timeline of the projects that we have and the money of the projects we have. An example, if you have a project for a young person that lasts 6 weeks or 8 weeks, on the 9th week the project is finished and there's a kind of space in which people are kind of dropped, and where is the connection that carries on. So what I'm doing here is developing a program which is a way of bringing people together for social gatherings that underpins the different creative projects that we have. So just to go into what excites me about Sistema in Europe, and particularly in the UK, I think it's the opportunities that the programs provide young people in our society as artists and as citizens, and also the opportunity that a program which is so big and so ambitious provides adults in a society to look again at what young people are doing, what young people are making. One of the things there are 3 things. The 3, I think, is a magic number that lots of the panelists will use, the 3 points throughout our comments. But for me, there are 3 things that I'm thinking about. One is the idea of music as a joyful agent for social change. The second is multiple identities. And the third one is the nuclear or the Sistema movement as a physical space in which people come into. And I'll just talk about each one of those. I think there's something powerful in the videos that we see in the approach from Venezuela and also from different countries. And Brazil, Neo-Jiba in Brazil has the same approach, which is a kind of forceful and proud declaration that this is about social change. And I think one of the things in the UK that we struggle, especially with projects for young people, is we kind of move away from this idea of actually saying that it's about changing our society and changing our communities. And there are lots of things that kind of come along with that in terms of conversations about, are we using arts in a kind of instrumental way? And I think those are really valid and should be kind of drilled into in terms of each program and the specifics of it. But for me, I think there's something incredibly powerful in young people being in a program which they know is about artistic or musical education and development, but also they know actually affects their everyday and affects how people see them and how people experience their community. And especially in terms of young people in the UK from working class communities, different communities, lots of the kind of cultural productions that they see about themselves are actively reflecting something that isn't themselves. And I think spaces and projects in which people can say, this is me, are positive places. The idea about multiple identities, one of the core principles of El Sistema, and you see it in lots of different programs, is the idea of treating people in the program as citizens, artists, teachers and scholars. And I think this forces us as adults to change our relationships with young people in our society, because when young people are multiple in their identities and their activities, we have to respond in turn. So children simply as learners is kind of a very easy situation for us, because we take them to school, they listen, they learn things, they come home, we ask them what they learned, we feel proud and good as parents and carers, and the next day goes on. But children as teachers and artists ask us to support them differently, to listen to them, to learn alongside them. And I think one of the things we have to work on in the UK is thinking again about this term intergenerational and also the family as well. I think from what I've experienced in Brazil, it's those things are more embedded in the culture, so they're easier to work with. I think in the UK it has to be some real serious attention paid to how we're integrating the creativity and exploration of young people with their family members and other people in the community, which isn't necessarily just based around the young people's learning experiences, but actually saying we're all learning all the time. I think this is part of the problem that we find in the separation between adults and teenagers in particular. I think sometimes we forget that, we say, oh, teenagers, you are learning, but we kind of don't express that we're learning as well. In 2008, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child commented about the UK as having a general climate of intolerance and negative public attitudes towards children, especially adolescents. And since there was, media reports and lots of conversations in 2008, but I think this is still something that we're trying to battle with. I think these projects, especially when for example, in Venezuela, where you see thousands and thousands of people coming to see the performances, it creates a kind of visibility for young people's creativity that is hard to ignore. And at the moment, I don't know, I think at the moment, one of the things we struggle with in the UK is about audiences and about getting people out to see young people who are developing and might be out of tune or offbeat, but still there. And I think one of the things we have to work on is finding an audience that will, one, spend time to see that, and two, pay money to see that, and three, collectively trying to find a way to support the development of those young people. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this nuclear, or the Sistemas model as a physical environment. I did music at school. I went to music classes, but I didn't really learn very much music. I didn't really learn to play an instrument. At secondary school, I used to love music lessons. Me and my friends would run from one part of the school to the other one to get a rehearsal room. It was about 3 meters by 3 meters, but you could fit 5 guys in it, and a piano and a guitar and some what we called shakers at the time. And we'd do things like cover the small windows so nobody could see us. And for the next 50 minutes, with the keyboards and speakers and the guitars, they'd all be there, but really the only music that was being played was the kind of pre-programmed green sleeves coming out of the keyboard. But for me, I kind of remember that as a good time, even though I didn't learn very much music, because it was one of the few spaces in the learning environment where me and my friends felt very comfortable and relaxed. And occasionally, somebody would strum a guitar to make it sound like we were learning. But I guess, I'm not kind of saying this to say, oh, poor me, I didn't learn a musical instrument at school, but just to highlight the fact that the music space was special in that context. And it's a shame that, for me, that didn't kind of carry on to learning an instrument. But I think it served the purpose socially for me and my friends that we had this kind of place of escape. And I think that place of coming together, the place of escape, and collaboration in the Sistemas movement is something that we can definitely learn from in the UK and Western Europe as a whole. And that's my comments.
Thanks, Jim. So something common here, I think, to what both of you are talking about is this question of a legislated piece of culture that we give to young kids to learn, or should they be given a space which is more powerfully their own to determine what that agenda is. Obviously classical music is the area which the Sistemas is most well known for. It's not the only area it works in by any means. Nathaniel, I just want to kind of bring you in at this stage. You're a sax player, you've worked through jazz a lot, and I just be interested to hear from you about looking at this.
Okay, well, you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to say hello. And secondly, that I should just explain a little bit about my own background. I'm a jazz musician primarily, and as Marshall mentioned already, I play the alto saxophone, but as well as that, I compose, I arrange, and I've been involved in a number of community projects, and I currently am a music leader for Tomorrow's Warriors, which is resident here at the South Bank, down in the Violet Room, and every Saturday I teach the developing young musicians, and the kind of, I guess, what we're aiming to do there is to develop young musicians into young professionals. So I teach the age group that ranges from I guess, around 15 up to 23. And in that group, I have many sort of very wide, diverse range of abilities, cultural backgrounds and heritage. And it's also the beautiful thing is that it's a lovely mix of both male and female. And something that a lot of people are talking about at the moment, I find, is the disparity in male and females working in particularly in the jazz idiom, I should say. And it's kind of seen a lot as a sort of male-dominated kind of industry, as it were. But I can safely say that that is something that's very much changing, and there's a lovely balance in that group. So aside from that, I took part in the Worshipful Company of Musicians Young Jazz Medalist Award, which I won, and since that time I've been performing outreach sessions at primary schools. And I'd just like to start off by, with an example. I actually played in one. It's an outreach session where we go into schools and play. I will play music for the kids and basically break down my instrument and explain all of the different parts and give them a chance to actually see this thing up close and personal. And it always surprises me that when they see the instrument, the saxophone, they're completely flabbergasted, bewildered, like never seen anything like it before. It looks almost like a sort of alien, I don't know, something that just landed from Mars to them. And the fascination and the kind of passion to want to know what this thing is that I'm holding and how does it work is something that I find really beautiful. And at the same time, a little bit worrying that our children don't engage with, they don't know, well, they don't have any kind of extensive knowledge of what instruments are. So I guess most children, I could take, a violin and show them that. Maybe some, you might get a kind of rough percentage that will know what the instrument is, but 9 times out of 10, I would say, when I turn up to do one of these outreach sessions and they see the saxophone and I say, well, what am I holding? Very rarely do I ever hear the words, oh, that's an alto saxophone. In fact, I've never heard those words. And actually, I think only once have I ever heard that's a saxophone. So there's something there that, there's a challenge immediately there that we face in this country and in Europe, I think. Maybe I'll speak for this country because that's really where my experience is mostly based in terms of teaching. But I have a lot of performance experience, and by the grace of God, I had the blessing to play around the world in something like 32 or 34 different countries. And that experience has been wonderful, not just for the obvious reasons of playing, but also to kind of engage with other people's culture. And this idea of culture is something that we're kind of talking about that's running through this, that I find really interesting, because here in London, it's massively diverse, as we all know, hugely diverse. And how do you deal with that cultural diversity when implementing a system like El Sistema? Particularly when, for example, someone wanted to describe me, they would just say black, but what does that mean? You say black, the African diaspora, if that's what we're referring to there, is very, very broad. So black Caribbean, black West African, East African, the southern part of Africa, or anywhere else, or even, let's say, black in the Latin American countries as well. That's a really, really very highly diverse range of people, and pretty much all of them are here in the UK and in London in particular. So I'm interested in how do we deal with that? How do we respect everyone's cultural backgrounds? It's very rare that someone kind of says to me, if someone asks me to describe the sort of racial mix of the group that I teach on Saturdays, for example, for Tomorrow's Warriors, which is a jazz development organisation. I hope I already said that, but if someone asked me to describe the backgrounds of people, you know, I'm not going to say, I probably wouldn't say I've got, you know, some white European children and then some black children. I will go specifically to where they're from, you know. I will say I have some people from Italy, from Spain, from Germany, from Holland, as well as Afro-Caribbean, African descent children that are either born here or born in, you know, in Africa or in the Caribbean. And all of those cultures are obviously completely different and have their own separate identities. So this question of how we deal with that when implementing something like El Sistema, the beautiful thing that really stood out to me immediately, and it's something I relate to very easily, because I guess with music, something that Yemasa was just talking about with the music block. The music block was my home in secondary school. From sort of year 9 onwards, that was my home at lunch times and break times. Up to that point, I guess the playground was, and you know, many hours spent playing football against the wall with a football or even a tennis ball, if that's all we had access to. But as soon as I had the opportunity to play an instrument, the music block is where I wanted to be. And I've really been a product of interaction with my peers. I've been fortunate enough, blessed enough to have one really good friend who is also an exceptional musician and also affiliated with the Worshipful Company of Musicians because he won the same award 2 years before me. He's a wonderful drummer and percussionist, musician and composer, Shaney Forbes. We went to the same secondary school, and around the same time that he started playing the drums, I started playing clarinet. So immediately, we had a sort of social connection beyond the normal things that kind of connect young people and children, and that was music. And with coming from a jazz perspective, what really, I guess, is a beautiful thing is that the jazz music has always been a massively community-based music. It's always been about social climate, and so with El Sistema being really about social change and expression, that's something that really speaks to me in a big way, because essentially my development as a musician has taken place because of the people that I've been around, interacted with, played with, worked with in a whole myriad of different contexts. And the relationship that I have musically with Shaney, for example, that's existed now for 15 years of my life, is one that has influenced all areas of my life beyond just music. Now, I'd like to just quote one of my favorite saxophone players in Charlie Parker, who said that music speaks louder than words. Something else that's really beautiful that John Coltrane echoed and was echoed in one of the clips we saw earlier is that music also expresses and says things that we can't actually say with words at all, and it expresses things that we can't actually, we can't sort of put down on a page, can't quantify in human speech. There are things that go well beyond that to the kind of spiritual world and realm, and that's a whole area of the human existence that I think is extremely important for young people to really not just have an understanding of, but engage with. And I should come back to the example I gave. I played in a school in Dalston last week, and one portion of the session that I delivered was basically to play something and then ask the children to describe what I played. And coming back to what one of the points that was made earlier about young people and their voice being heard, that's also something that's really important to me. And again, with jazz music, it's not just as simple as the older masters know best, and you as a young person don't have anything to bring or contribute until you've learned enough stuff to be able to speak for yourself, which is kind of how we approach speech in this country, I think, and how we approach knowledge in this country. It's like you learn you imitate mum or dad or whoever it is, and then you learn the words, and then you learn what they mean. And then once you've gone through that whole process, then then you can be considered someone that's sort of the intellectual value to, call it an adult, or someone that's heading towards adulthood. I don't really think that's the case at all. And children, from the moment you're born, you have a kind of openness that really needs to be cultivated, not what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, not constrained, exactly. And that's something that I think we do really well in this country, is we limit children by telling them what they can and can't achieve. So what I was really interested to find out when I did this thing in this outreach session, I played, and then I asked all of the children to just speak to me, tell me what they thought and felt. I had one young lady give me a really detailed description of falling through the air, and then the feeling of air, and the feeling of falling really, 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 really fast somewhere and it wasn't a kind of, I'm falling from the sky to earth. It was beyond that. It was much more, it was a kind of, just a beautiful image of falling, and then that falling feeling kind of slowing down. Then one young child, one boy, these children, by the way, are aged 5 and 6. This one young boy gave me a really beautiful description of how it was like being in those moments in a movie where time speeds up and a number of things happen in that portion of time, and then it goes back to being normal. How am I doing for time?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
fine.
Okay. Yeah, I should also point out the fact that I had my phone on the stage is because I got my notes on there. It's 2013, so just the nature of things. Just to finish up, really, the community and collective ability to express things is really what is one huge thing that I think we need to be looking to really address with any kind of system in this country. And really, I'll echo what Yemasai said, it has to be different from Venezuela, where the cultural background is, would it be fair for me to say that it's a bit more limited, let's say, than maybe, in terms of the amount of different kinds of cultural people there are there, than, say, London, for example, where there are people from all over Europe, all over Africa, all over the world, basically right here in this tiny little city, which is actually too small to hold all of them. So we really, really, really need to consider that. And I had a whole load of other things that I always do this. I make too many notes, and then
Well, we're all the same.
yeah, it's inevitable. But just to the sort of focus on social change and musical excellence, something that Pam mentioned was that with children, what do they interact with on a daily basis in our culture here in this country? Where music is concerned, in the different subcultures, so shall we say, of people that are here in London, there are many different kinds of relationship. My own, for example, I'm Caribbean in origin. My family is from Jamaica, and we were all churchgoers from day one. So the church, it is a community in terms of how it works in Jamaica. It's a family, and within that family, there's a constant passing on and passing down of knowledge and information, and it goes backwards and forwards between young people and older, more experienced people. And young people's voices, well, in the particular kind of group of my family, are heard. They're not kind of disregarded, and that's something. In order for something like our Sistemas to work here, that has to be really paramount. And at the same time, like I think I will just finish there by saying that the backgrounds of all of the people that are here in London and in the UK at large, it's so broad that you really have to consider where people are from and their relationship with music. And speaking from my own background, dance, movement is an inherent part of it. The other thing is this kind of cultural prejudice that we have where someone perceives the classical musical tradition to be of a higher worth and higher nature than the jazz musical tradition or any other. And that is something that's quite ridiculous and ignorant, and we really need to get past that in order to really have a kind of rounded system that makes the kind of openness of artistic expression open to all young people, which is hopefully what I would love to see happen through some Sistemas growing in this country.
Great. Thank you very much. Claire, you're the director of the Institute of Ideas. You deal in ideas. You're not specifically a musician or within that fraternity. So what do you make of all this?
I'm not only not specifically a musician, I'm remotely a musician. But I am interested in arts and education, and have been following the El Sistema story actually for a while. And there's a lot to admire in El Sistema in Venezuela, and I was very excited about it, like everybody else, and have been very excited about it. But I've become recently a little bit more wary. I've become wary because I feel as though it's become a kind of catch-all international solution for every social problem everywhere, and a very fashionable orthodoxy that I think can lead to complacency. And the kind of question about translation, I think that my problem is that the core ideals of El Sistema in Venezuela are getting lost in translation. So just to give, so I'm now going to do the three things like everyone else. My first one is that, El Sistema in its origins is a genuine social activism project. It's got that sort of idea of music as a social saviour. But I can't, I'm sure I don't need to stress to this audience, or we shouldn't underestimate just how utterly dull that idea can become in a UK context. And we have put up with years of the kind of deadening social engineering approach to the arts that's become institutionalised in this country for many years. And, ever since, New Labour 97 particularly, there's been a whole range of this kind of social activism as the only thing that you're ever allowed to say about music and the arts, in fact. The arts have had to prove their worth. It's been demanded that they reduce crime, improve health, fight racism, reduce the number of teenage pregnancies, my favourite one. A whole series of art galleries had reduction of teenage pregnancy projects. Everybody's set up there isn't a gallery that hasn't had a variety, the kind of things I mean. Pro-multiculturalism, a skateboarding part, that's what I was going to say. There isn't a gallery in the country that hasn't had a skateboarding initiative at some stage involved in it, kind of young people and all the rest of it. It's been absolutely revolting. And there's actually been quite a big kickback against it. And my concern is now that El Sistema is going to give a kind of radical edge to that rather old, dull argument. I do think that it is important to note that people like me, of course, who argue for art and music for its own sake, who've been written off as kind of old-fashioned and ridiculous and all the rest of it, but that actual, in all of these kind of social engagement projects in the West, the arts are completely marginalised and sidelined. The only thing is the social outcome. And I don't think that's what happens in El Sistema in Venezuela, but it could well and is happening here. And I also think, and just to give one example on that, is the idea that, to use a quote that's been quoted from Venezuela, which is that orchestras and choirs are incredibly effective instruments against violence. Now, I think I know what that probably means in the context of Venezuela, but needless to say, it's been used here to talk about, we've got to get music education, otherwise we're going to have riots again. How can we kind of get people to behave well in school, all the rest of it. And there's a little bit of me that thinks, on the one hand, this is a real insult to music, to kind of treat it as a kind of insipid pacifier. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I hear Beethoven's Ninth or Shostakovich, I feel like going out to start a revolution. The idea that the El Sistemas in this country called In Harmony you do think, oh no. It's kind of like sit around and hold hands and we'll all get on well and we'll all sing together and play instruments together and it'll all be wonderful. I think it could kill the soul of music if we carry on like this. And it certainly destroys the autonomy of the listener. But apart from anything else, it's all a bit of an odd idea anyway, because ever since, as it happens, violence in Venezuela has gone up immeasurably since El Sistema started. So if it's going to...
Can I just... It's gone up immeasurably since Chavez was in power in the late 90s.
Of course I'm not blaming El Sistema. That wasn't...
No, but I want to say something...
Let me finish my point.
Yeah.
Because my point is exactly that, right?
Yeah.
Which is that if you end up with these mad assertions and overclaiming, you end up in this mad situation whereby...
That I'll agree with, yes.
Yes, that was my point. That's my point. Of course I'm not blaming El Sistema for the increase in violence. I didn't actually think that El Sistema should be responsible for decreasing it. That was my point.
Yes.
Right, okay, got yes. Right, okay. But I do understand El Sistema in Venezuela was a genuine social movement, social activism that I had a lot of time for, but it grew out of very specific social conditions, particular issues facing Venezuelan children growing up in desperate shanty towns, in dire poverty, in makeshift, chaotic barrios, dominated by drugs and crime, many children not going to school, and so on and so forth. And undoubtedly for those children, the enthusiasm to use music as a vehicle to escape wasn't necessarily just a physical escape, but a real kind of transcendental escape through beautiful music. It's something that I think we can all understand as part of the inspiring story. And one music critic after performance said, these young people play as if their life depends on it, and in some ways perhaps they do. And I think that is the very specific Venezuela story. Right, the sprawling levels of poverty in Venezuela are very different to the conditions in the UK, even in a recession, despite kind of overclaiming to the contrary. Poverty is not as widespread or severe, but I don't think it's just a technical or a cultural idea, because I do think that El Sistema fits into that historic tradition, which actually, as it happens, has fine roots in the UK, of people from socially deprived backgrounds taking control of their destiny through self-improvement and education, that kind of grasping, the British working class in the 19th, 20th century, early part of the 20th century very much did that. Right, fast forward 2013 Britain. Right, we have a cultural problem, which is that there is very little respect for self-help and taking your own life into your own hands. The state treats the poor as hopeless and hapless victims, objects of policy interventions. They're done too, and I think that's bred a really demoralising sense of entitlement, particularly amongst the young, who have a kind of expect the state to sort everything out, a kind of demoralising aspect of welfarism, and where poverty is often seen as a determining fate, even by the left, which is that if you're poor, you'll inevitably end up here, you'll inevitably be like this, and I think that that's not been very helpful. That then, in this context of today, is married with a kind of generation of people who are being reared actually on pupils' voice, student voice, children's rights, the me generation, a kind of narcissism that's bred into the young as they're fawned over and flattered by everyone who tells them how interesting they are. We've heard a lot of that tonight on the stage this morning. A kind of educational embrace of therapeutic trends as well, and married with a celebrity culture that sells young people fame and success and that their dreams will come true, but without any effort at all. I think all of that is a pretty toxic mix that means that British young people are sadly not necessarily open to the El Sistema model. The bits of it that I admire, because part of the El Sistema model is the intense training associated with learning to become excellent in playing music. Something which I think gets ignored when we translate it here sometimes. I think it clashes that idea of pushing children hard, demanding serious commitment, and that actually you have to do so many hours a day. It's not just a question of they couldn't fit it in with school, but the idea that we would demand that children do that many hours a day or 6 days a week, that we insist on repetitive, rigorous, fast-paced rehearsals, lots of practice that's boring and so on and so forth. I mean, if you do that in this country, you're likely to be branded as an authoritarian bully, imposing your will on young people. And I don't think that British kids, it's not that I don't think that British kids are up to the demands of a strong work ethic, but I do think that adults have set the bar fairly low. We assume that young people have got the attention span of a gnat, constantly need to be praised. I used to teach English for many years in further education, and we know that these days, we kind of teach them gobbets of literature because we don't think they're up to reading a book. And young people themselves internalise this, go to university and say, what's that book list? It's too long. And teachers are actually accused of abuse for reprimanding teenagers, for example, for poor attendance in classes or excessive workloads. And we all know that it's not just a joke that people say, if you make me do that, I'll report you to the NSPCC. I think that there's, a lot of the discussion on, sadly, I think, on the abuse in music schools that's gone on recently, the serious sexual abuse that we all know about. But actually that has led to a rather unhelpful discussion by people who basically said it's not just the sexual abuse, which is rare and over there, but that actually the whole of music education culture is abusive. And I thought it was interesting that you talked about inspiring leaders, because inspiring leaders have now been dubbed as domineering, manipulative adults who demand that young people take lessons from them and follow them. I think, well, that's the thing is not going to translate here because they will be locked up. What I'm trying to say is that we have become overly cautious of inspiring leadership and putting young people under pressure, is my point. Right, my last point then is that the main barrier to self-sustainment taking off here, but the one I most regret, is that we've developed an incredibly chippy attitude to classical music and high art. Actually, in the criticism of self-sustainment that's come up in the last year or so from people I know that you've been involved in answering some of those critics, the criticism has been the problem with self-sustainment is that it's guilty of cultural imperialism, it's Eurocentric, it's middle-class cultural creep, privileging Western classical music and high art that is elitist and exclusionary. And there's been and it's an attempt to civilise the lower orders. The thing about that is that in this country we've developed this attitude that assumes that classical music alienates working class youth. It's got to the point that in my tube station, I live in Wood Green, and this is a Transport for London initiative, they now play on a hoop Wagner, Schubert, Liszt, Beethoven and everyone else to put young people off hanging around the tube station.
That's true.
Luckily what's happened is what's actually happened is it hasn't worked, but the Transport for London people have all become right dab hands that's humming along, as it were, and they're great fans. So there you go. But it's a completely patronising idea that classical music is a cultural imposition. That's my point. But that's actually, self-sustainment should be not defensive about this, but we should be proud about it. But there are those who spit out accusations, cultural relativism, it's obviously very popular here, of the hierarchy of cultural value. You say accusingly that you believe in the superiority of classical music, and I do. I think classical music is superior to popular music, which I thoroughly enjoy, but which is ephemeral and superficial, and not as challenging and not as difficult, and it is not as good. I think that there are too often patronising assumptions about young people's own culture being good enough for them. So I was excited when there was a big initiative to improve music teaching in schools a few years ago, until I found out that all the music teachers were being sent on re-education classes so that they could familiarise themselves with their pupils' cultural musical tastes, and so that they would be relevant to young people. And we all know the story. You want to attract inner city black youth to classical music venues, and you put on rap, hip-hop, beatbox rather than Beethoven. It is irritatingly insulting, it goes across the board. So when, for example, it's said that the people of Raploch Estate in Scotland have their own musical culture that shouldn't be forcibly replaced by classical music, that's one of the arguments, you have to say, what is the musical culture of Raploch Estate? I mean, what is it? And do we seriously think that it's going to beat Beethoven anytime soon? And I was disappointed that the first concert of the Big Noise Glasgow Initiative Youth Orchestra, after 10 weeks of tuition, they performed Scottish folk songs. I think it's not translating well if we end up there. I'm disappointed that Cleveland, Ohio's Al Sistema programme really concentrated on developing a new version for violin and cello of Michael Jackson's Beat It. On the basis that the song has a strong message for kids growing up amid urban violence. Subliminally, it encourages children to be responsible when confronted with peer pressure and tell their bullies to beat it. And we've heard about pupils and their own repertoire and so on. Anyway, you get the gist of it, like all that.
Push you now, so
yes,
leave time for the audience.
That's it. Okay.
It's good.
Yeah. I think that. My view is that the prejudice that poor people in Venezuela or people from different backgrounds in this country won't get classical music is the Eurocentric prejudice, not the other way around. It's a middle class prejudice about ordinary people who they don't believe are up to it, and that they can kind of have their folk music and we'll have Wagner and Beethoven here. Araya makes a very good point. He says you have to give them something different. And this is when he says you shouldn't just replay back salsa to people in the barrios who have grown up on salsa. Quote, you have to give them something different, and when they sit in one of those chairs in the orchestra, they think they're on another country and another planet. 11-year-old Alicia Patino says, it's got to the point round here where it's much cooler to like Strauss and salsa. Bassoonist Edgar Monroe, 22, whose mates are all either dead or drug addicts or in jail, says, I like Brahms best, so romantic, but my favourite is Shostakovich's Ninth. It's hard to say what happened exactly. I fell in love with the music, though it was strange to me from the barrio, but it helped me to rise above what happens where I live. And Edgar is really the most perceptive commentator of all, and this is what I'd like us to bring into and translate into Britain. He says, maybe it's ironic that the music is classical from Europe, but it's a strong tradition and it's opened up our world. It told us who Mozart and Beethoven were, and they could be ours, and they gave us an escape. They could be ours. One bit of Al Sistema we should push, and it's a battle that we have to have in the West, is that we should demand that the orchestral masterworks of the Western canon and high art are the universal birthright for all. They could be ours, all of ours. That's what I take as inspiration from El Sistema. Thank you.
Thank you very much.